Thank you so much indeed, Umit, for that very kind welcome. First, please allow me, give me the latitude to express my thanks. My thanks to the Government of Canada for hosting this Metropolis Conference, especially to IRCC for their support. And as you said, Umit, this isn't your day jobs, but I tell you what, you've got a second career because this is going beautifully. I'd also really like to thank Enrico, especially, and his team for organising such a fantastic event. And also the participants. What I've really been very impressed by is the level of engagement. Look at this room, it's nearly full. And we're on, what, day 3. This is really wonderful. So thank you so much for engagement in the plenaries and also in the workshops. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the Algonquin nation and peoples. I think this is particularly important coming from an immigration country with a very significant Indigenous population myself. And I'd also really like to acknowledge the generosity and the open spirit of engagement that has been set by the conference organisers. And I think this is really important. We've had wonderful keynotes, we've had fantastic plenaries. This is not by accident, this is by design. It has been inclusive, it's been inspirational, and it's also been courageous, as we've seen in several plenaries. And I really would like to applaud the organisers for this. I think it's distinctive. It's good. So let's get on with my bit. We had a wonderful teleconference last week, and we talked about what we would be particularly focusing on. It's a very, very big subject, as we all know, migration and technology. And it does resonate historically, but there are very recent changes in technology that make us really want to look at what's occurring now, as Umit mentioned, the kind of the darker forces, and also what it means strategically for what I call the double-edged sword, some of the opportunities and some of the challenges related to technology and migration. The perspective that I would like to take is on migrants' perspectives and what do we know about research and analysis as well as programmatic work in terms of how migrants are engaging with technology throughout the cycle. Very, very quickly, I'm not going to read this out, but we do know that technology, and especially in the last decade, has been a game changer for all of us. It's reshaped economies, social interactions, and our collective security at the personal level, but also at the international level. And cybersecurity, for example, is a very pressing concern for many countries around the world. It's impacting on all areas of society and policy, the financial sector, in terms of politics, democracy especially, and governance, but also migration. We know this, I don't need to repeat this, but it's worthwhile drawing your attention to the last 3 dot points, because we know that migration is not uniform across the world, and that there are certain areas, traditional immigration countries, for example, such as Canada, Australia, US and New Zealand, and I put that in terms of modern times. We're not talking historically, we are talking about modern times. There's the traditional guest worker countries, which we heard about in one of the plenaries earlier in the conference. The Gulf especially, in terms of guest worker countries, but there are also countries of refugee and displacement, as we heard this morning in terms of the IDP discussion. Migration and technology and displacement is interacting in different ways in different parts of the world, including because of the very big leapfrog that we've seen, and this is World Bank data but drawing on ITU data over time, longitudinal data. We're seeing a leapfrogging of mobile or cellular phone subscriptions globally. So what that means is many of us have come from kind of an internet PC base, and then we've transitioned through into smartphones. But a lot of countries, Afghanistan is one of them, which has leapfrogged landlines and PC-based internet connectivity straight into smartphones. And that is becoming a game changer in terms of migration, but also other aspects. Now, in terms of migration and technology, I'd really like to just very briefly mention that it is being increasingly used throughout the migration cycle, right the way from origin country, pre-departure decision-making and preparation. Technology is being used more and more and more in different forms, whether that is asylum seeking, whether that is student mobility, whether that's permanent migration. It's also occurring during the act of journeys. around the act of migrating itself. And we talk about the application of migration and increased global mobility. But also border management technology has really changed in the last 2 decades around technology, the use of biometrics and so forth. But then also integration, reintegration and return migration and how that is affecting migrants' identities as well as their connectivity with home, transit and destination countries. And then we'll also hear from others today about migration technology in public debates, a very interesting area, including in relation to disinformation, as Umut mentioned, and the changing of the truth and how that is occurring through technology and different platforms. And then, of course, in terms of how we actually undertake migration research and analysis, big data analysis we hear a lot about, the huge amount of material and data that is available for analytical purposes. The 3 areas that resonate most strongly with migrants and their interaction are the 3 that I've highlighted there, so I'll very, very briefly give you an overview on those. Migrant tech, very quickly, what it means. In the literature, the academic and policy literature, it really is down to 2 things: migrants' use of technology throughout the migration cycle, but also technology that is being increasingly developed by migrants themselves to support others through migration processes, whether that's integration or whether that's journeys. It's also being used increasingly to encompass migrants who are working in the tech sector, and as we know, there are very large proportions of international migrants who are very influential in the tech sector around innovation and collaboration. Why does migrant tech matter? From a migrant's perspective, it's very important. It empowers people who are exploited and abused or at risk of being exploited or abused. It expands access to a range of different services, including transnationally. It does support and it can support the protection of migrants throughout the cycle. Very importantly, it allows for migrants' voices to be heard in a range of different contexts and different settings. But it also points to gaps and to weaknesses within systems, and it can improve the quality of services and the experiences of migrants and non-migrants in communities. First of all, migrant decision-making and ICT. As many of the scholars in the audience know, there is a very rich and long-term body of research and analysis on migrant decision-making. But what we're seeing in the last sort of 5 to 10 years is a subsection of that really focusing on the application of ICT and how that is affecting decision-making. The key findings is that ICT is increasingly prevalent, although it's very uneven. Some areas throughout the world have very good connectivity, other areas don't have good connectivity, but we're also seeing demographic issues, even within families and within communities. Some segments of the community won't have as great access to ICT, such as women, such as some minorities and so forth, and that's having an impact too on the use. We're also seeing that the use of technology and ICT in particular can compound social pressures to migrate through seeing relative deprivation across different systems, as well as how people are undertaking journeys. And there can be a lot of social pressure in origin to migrate and also not to return for fear of shame and so forth. The application of migration, which I'm sure many of you have read about over time, particularly came to prominence in 2015 and 16 with the movement of migrants, including refugees, through to Greece and then onward into other parts of Europe. It's also been very prevalent in regards to the Venezuelan movement and also the migrant caravans through Central America. Those are just a few examples, recent examples. But what I would like to do is just to take you back more than 70 years and read an excerpt of a chapter from the next World Migration Report and really take you back to a time which was post-Second World War to try and crystallise how migration and technology has changed and how we've become so accustomed to smartphones as a form of communication. So we're back just in the aftermath of World War II. Back then there was no internet, there were no mobile phones, there were no fax machines, and postal services were slow and often disrupted. Telegram and telephone communication was limited and costly. Paolina Roccanello arrived in Melbourne in April 1947 from Italy with her mother on the SS Missouri in the shadow of the war. They were lucky to be reunited with their father, who had emigrated to Australia 8 years before, expecting his family to follow soon after. For all their wartime separation, they received only one of his letters, which had taken 5 years to reach them. Now, for us now, that is just totally bizarre. In real time, we can connect with people right across the world, and we are able to maintain connectivity. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but this is a very, very significant shift that we often forget about. Tech and integration is becoming increasingly successful at supporting migrants as they have moved, and it's operating at the local level. We'll hear probably more about this tomorrow in the Migrants and Cities Plenary, but migrants are increasingly using technology to reconnect, to familiarise themselves. It's a growing area where migrants themselves are creating apps and creating other device mechanisms to be able to support and provide services to each other and to connect with local governments, for example. Those are some of the few issues that have been put together, including by a Canadian researcher, actually, who's recently published an overview of the systematic review of kind of like the literature on this topic from the University of Ottawa. This is a growing area that I would certainly like to see more research on, tech and transnational families. This is a very good example of the double-edged sword. So while we can use mobile money apps to remit more easily and more cheaply around the world, and that's certainly grown in prominence in the last 10 years, we're able to Skype and WhatsApp parent, a particular challenge, but it makes it feasible when we have split families. But there's a big issue to be answered and to be really looked at and examined in regards to social change, what it means for decision making, feminisation of migration, children left behind and the impacts in regards to children who are separated from parents, and also children who are household providers. We're seeing that increasingly, and especially in Southeast Asia. Split families, it's feasible, technology enables it, but at what cost? And this is a growing area of concern for many researchers. Key issues for migrants in quick summary: empowerment and self-agency, particularly important in terms of the use of technology and social connections. Economic advancement, such as through mobile money and remittances. But also the quality of information and advice is really questionable. There's risk and unsafe journeys, mistrusted sources. How can we ensure that information is accurate, it's timely? As Umut mentions, there's very significant concerns in regards to personal data, and also there's differential access to ICT globally. Finally, last slide, key issues for policy and practice. I've bunched those together. There are many, many more, but the key issues that come out for policy and practice are, for example, migrant vulnerability and exploitation, safety from persecution, of course, but what does that mean sometimes for irregular migration settings and border management and the challenge that can be faced with border management? We're also seeing regulation, fake news and disinformation, which is certainly going to be discussed in the panel today, and tailoring information and services for those people who are practitioners and trying to reach migrants and trying to support migrants. That is a growing area of concern and a growing area where we can see a lot of solutions, not just some of the challenges. Thank you.